It was 5:35 a.m., and I found myself seated in a booth at the Sunset Inn, nursing a cup of coffee while waiting for Lindsay to serve my usual order, pancakes with a side of crispy bacon. As I topped off my cup from the small coffee pot left on the table, I couldn't help but reflect on why I was there at such an ungodly hour. I was no stranger to this place. I typically stopped by 3 or 4 times a week, but never this early. In fact, this was the first time I'd ever been there when they opened their doors at 5:30 sharp. A more sensible person might have just gone home and climbed into bed, but I didn't. I knew that even if I managed to fall asleep, the night would be plagued with restless tossing, and God only knows what kind of nightmares would come creeping into my mind. It was a tale as old as time, played out 100 times a day somewhere on this spinning third rock from the sun. Boy goes out of town for a few days, returns earlier than expected, only to discover that the girl in his life isn't exactly his alone. I couldn't help but wonder, out of all those similar stories happening around the world, how many times the other man turned out to be a family member. I had called Whitney to let her know I'd be back that evening instead of Saturday, but when she didn't pick up her phone, I didn't think much of it. My flight touched down around 7, and by 8, I was pulling into the parking lot of our apartment complex. As I straightened out the car from the turn, I caught sight of Whitney stepping out of the building and walking toward a car I knew all too well. I instinctively hit the brakes, stopping just short of where she might have seen me. From my vantage point, I watched her slide into the passenger seat, lean over, and kiss the driver. Saying I was shocked would be the understatement of the century. Whitney had always made it perfectly clear that she couldn't stand my brother, Bill. To her, he was the epitome of arrogance, a man who walked around like his shit didn't stink. Yet, there she was, getting cozy in his car and locking lips with him like they were high school sweethearts. My mind raced with questions that had no immediate answers. I decided to follow them, keeping a careful distance so Bill wouldn't spot me in his rearview mirror. They drove to Duke's Steakhouse, parked the car, shared another kiss, and headed inside. I was familiar enough with Duke's to know there was no way I could follow them inside without being seen, so I parked where I had a clear view of Bill's car and settled in to wait. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the restaurant, got back in the car, and started making out again, this time for a good 5 minutes. Then they drove off to their next stop, the Barnyard, a country western joint with live music. Just like Duke's, the Barnyard wasn't the kind of place where I could slip in unnoticed, so once again I parked where I could see the car and waited. They were in there for 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours of me sitting in my car, stewing in a mix of disbelief and rage. When they finally reappeared, I tailed them once more. This time to the Willow Creek Motel. My gut twisted when I saw Bill check in at the front desk and then lead Whitney to room 107. I gave them a good 15 minutes to get settled and start doing what they were obviously there for. Then, I quietly got out of my car, walked over to Bill's vehicle, and let the air out of all 4 tires. I wasn't done yet, though. I returned to my car, parked close enough to see the motel entrance, and waited. I wanted to witness Bill's reaction when he discovered the state of his tires in the dead of night. As I sat there, watching the silent motel, my thoughts drifted back to the past few months. Since I wasn't expected home for another 2 days, why didn't they just use the bed in our apartment? Then it hit me. Courtney. Whitney couldn't risk doing anything with Courtney around. And Bill? There was no way he could take Whitney back to our parents' house. He lived in the small apartment over the garage, and our mom or dad could easily see everything from the kitchen window. They would instantly recognize Whitney if she showed up there. I also wondered how long this had been going on. Was this their first rendezvous, or had it become a regular thing every time I went out of town? I usually took business trips every 4 or 5 weeks. Had they been taking advantage of my absence all along? After a couple of hours, I accepted the reality. They were likely spending the night at the motel. I abandoned my vigil and decided to head home. On my way, the glowing neon sign of the Sunset Inn caught my eye, and I thought, why not? Breakfast was as good a distraction as any. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw Lindsay unlocking the door, ready to start the day. The first time I saw Whitney was my senior year in college. She was a sophomore, and on normal grounds, we probably would have never crossed paths. We didn't share any classes or mutual friends, but fate brought us together one Friday night at a fraternity-sorority mixer. Members from other fraternities attended as well, in addition to my own. Halfway down into the afternoon, as I was walking through the long hallway toward the bathroom, I heard a sudden cry from the end. "Let go of me!" Instinctively, I speed up, just turning the corner at the top of the stairs perfectly to see this guy dragging a girl toward one of the bedrooms. He wasn't in my fraternity, and I didn't know him. Instinctively, I knew I had to intervene and try to contain the situation before it escalated. Our house had a reputation for this kind of shit. I walked over to him, forcing himself to tell the girl to go. He looked around and growled at me. "Mind your own business. This has nothing to do with you." As I lived, we didn't exactly learn how to handle things easy. Nobody ever taught us about the Marquis of Queensberry rules. We were simple. Hit them first, hit them hard, and make sure they don't get up. His insult barely had time to echo in the air before I kneed him square in the groin. As he doubled over in pain, I followed up with a sharp elbow to the side of his head, knocking him out cold. Hitting without padded gloves wasn't the best idea if you wanted to save your hands. He hit the floor hard, out for the count. I got around to check the girl, but she had already gone, racing downstairs in a flash. With a shrug, I went to the bathroom, thinking that the situation must have resolved itself. I came out. He was still there, dazedly trying to shake cobwebs off his head. I grabbed a couple of brothers from downstairs, explained what was going on, and we escorted the guy out. Troy, one of my brothers, knew him, and rounded up a few of the guy's frat brothers to take care of the rest. The girl simply vanished into thin air. I briefly looked for her that night, but didn't find her again. Days passed, and the whole thing went out of my mind. 3 weeks later, I was having my lunch in a booth at Annie's Cafe, feeling really casual about it all, when a girl came up to me and asked if she could join. She sort of looked vaguely familiar, so I nodded and invited her to sit. Knowing she had the feeling she knew me, she simply smiled and said, "You don't remember me, do you?" "I'm sorry," I answered. "You seem familiar, but I can't quite place you." She smiled warmly. "The Kappa House mixer? You rescued me from that caveman?" The memory sparked. "I didn't get a real good glimpse of you that evening, and when I looked around afterwards, you were gone." "I know. I should have waited around to thank you, but I was so afraid, so I ran." She took a moment to collect her thoughts. "I did not even want to attend that mixer in the first place. I had heard numerous horror stories of what goes on at fraternity parties. In the punch, date rape, drugs, girls getting cornered, and worse. But my sisters told me that nothing like that ever happened at Kappa, so I went. I had a great time until I came out of the bathroom. That guy, he grabbed me, called me a prick tease, and said he was going to teach me a lesson. And then you showed up." "So, what exactly did you do to make him think you were a prick tease?" I asked, rather curious. "Nothing," she answered quickly. "I was just being friendly with everybody, chatting away. He made his moves earlier in the evening, and I also told him I wasn't interested. That's it. I don't think of anything I might have done that would make him think I was teasing him." She heaved a soft sigh as she carried on with, "I really owe you a big thanks for stepping in that night. All I could think of at the time was getting out of there as quickly as possible. This is the first time I've seen you since. Hence, I wanted to give you my belated thanks. Oh, and by the way, my name is Whitney." "Well then, Miss Whitney," I said with a grin, "I accept your belated thanks, but if you're truly grateful, I think you owe me a favor. How about going on a date with me? At least once." Whitney smiled, clearly amused. "I'd like that. When?" "Are you free tonight?" I asked. "Yes, I am." "Great. How does 6 sound?" "Perfect," she replied with a twinkle in her eye. That evening led to many more dates. By the time I graduated 3 months later, Whitney and I were inseparable. After the 10th date, Whitney and I began making love. There was nothing awkward about it. Both partners experienced and comfortable with each other. Right from the very beginning, there was a natural chemistry between us. The more intimate we were, the wilder Whitney seemed to get. She liked that it was a risk to do it in public, where she might get caught, and that is the sort of excitement that would light up her passion. And, by herself, mine. We never really got caught, although there were a few close calls that just kept on pumping the adrenaline. The first time that Whitney met my family was during my graduation party when my folks staged it in celebration of my achievement. She charmed my mom and dad at once, as if she had known them forever. I remember my brother Bill did not blink an eye on her throughout the night, though then I was not concerned. She was beautiful, and guys would look at Whitney and wish they were in my shoes. This is just the way it used to be with her. Just as I was about to leave, my sister whispered in my ear in secret, her voice rich in truth. "You really lucked out here, bro. Don't let this one slip away." That night, after taking Whitney back to her sorority, I popped the question. She beamed and said yes, but with a caveat: "Not till graduation, lover. Once I get my degree, I'll walk down that aisle to you." True, getting married as soon as possible sounded too good to pass up. I respected her decision, though, as it made perfect sense, even if the wait would be difficult. Having not yet found a job, I followed Whitney home to spend the summer with her family. I spent one whole week with her family, and her parents were friendly, and I clicked pretty well with her younger sister. They seemed as pleased to have me as I was pleased with them. After visiting her family, I returned to my home and began trying out to get jobs. Whitney stayed with her family for the remainder of the summer break. With her off, I had a good amount of my time to dive headfirst into finding work. Luck favors me, and within a week, I landed a solid job. A new job means a great deal of change in life. I was becoming an independent person. It was time to cut the apron strings metaphorically. I had lived at home until now that I had a degree and was employed. I felt it was time to start looking for my own place. As a graduation gift from my parents, they gave me a check worth $10,000, which went toward payment of the first month's and the last month's rent and security deposit on an apartment. The remaining sum furnished the place and started slowly settling it. I used to call Whitney nearly every evening to update her on my new job, but did not let her know anything about the apartment. I wanted to surprise her when she got back to school. The wait was a suspenseful one due to what was to happen when she reacted to it. Whitney was back 3 days prior to the beginning of the new semester. I could hardly contain myself on the day I went to pick her up from the airport. I didn't go directly to campus, but into my apartment. I was pulling into the parking lot when Whitney furrowed her brow and asked, "Why are we stopping here?" And with that wicked grin spreading across my face, I declared, "Well, it's over a month now since we've made love. I thought you might want to break in my new bed." "Your new bed?" she asked, her words dripping with curiosity. "Yeah, this is where I live now," I replied in the most nonchalant tone. Once inside, I gave her a tour of the apartment, holding back the bedroom for last. When we finally made it into the room, I couldn't resist needling her. "There's plenty of space in the closet for your things, and the dresser has 3 empty drawers. Of course, if you'd rather stay at the sorority house, I can always find something else to fill them with." She turned towards me, her eyes sparkling in good humor and mischief. "When do I move in?" she asked. "Well," I said with a smirk, "we could leave now to go get your things, or we could get to it first and then go." Whitney laughed, kidding me. "Oh boy, decisions. What the hell? Since we're already here, might as well get the lovemaking out of the way first." It was passionate. It seemed as if the long weeks we'd spent apart had been sharpening everything between us, making everything sharper and more intense. Whitney was ravenous. I couldn't keep up with her. We loved and loved again until both of us were utterly and completely spent. Wrapped in each other's arms, I soon fell into a deep, satisfied slumber. She took me to work the next morning, parking the car so she could move her belongings from the sorority house to the apartment later in the day. That night, she came by my apartment after work, and we went out to dinner for a celebratory meal before we headed back to the apartment, where she quickly revived what had begun the night before. Once again, she made sure I was totally exhausted, working to the best of her abilities to get me in a nice state of exhaustion. Well, the next year went by in a bit of a blur, as Whitney and I adjusted to each other's almost full-time presence. The bumps started to happen like in any other couple who was learning how to get along with one another in such close proximity. Whitney was still a full-time student, so we would have to work around her class schedule, study groups, and the events that she would attend as a part of her sorority membership. Meanwhile, I had my own challenges, late nights at work, the occasional Saturday shift, and out-of-town business trips. In spite of the hiccups, we were able to make it work, and in that process, get a good sense of what life might be like in the future, married. Whitney was firm, though, that there wasn't going to be a wedding until after graduation. That didn't bother me all that much. To my thinking, we were as good as married already. The paperwork was a mere formality. I was content with the way things were working out. Summer break finally arrived, and I took a week of my vacation to spend at Whitney's parents' house with her. Then I needed to return to work, and the next 5 weeks dragged on and on. We called each other 2 or 3 times a week, talking plenty of I miss yous and I love yous. It wasn't the same, though. When she finally came back, 2 weeks before the start of the new semester, we really made up for lost time, mostly in the bedroom, making up the long, isolating weeks apart. One night, after an especially intense session that left me lying next to her, completely spent, Whitney started playfully running her hand along my body, trying to stir me up for one more round. She leaned in and whispered, "I need a favor, a really big favor." With a smirk, I replied, "After what you just did to me, I don't think I could refuse you anything." "What is it?" "Courtney flies in on Saturday," she started, "and she's beginning her freshman year. I thought perhaps you wouldn't mind if she stayed with us for a bit, until she gets her feet on the ground." I liked Courtney, and since we had a spare bedroom that wasn't being used, I didn't see any reason not to help her out. "No problem at all, sweetie," I said, "but you might need to stick a rag in your mouth when we make love. You can be a bit loud, and we wouldn't want to keep Courtney up all night." Whitney swatted playfully at me. "I'm not that loud." "Oh, you definitely are," I teased. "And since you've managed to get me up again, I'll happily prove it to you." And I did. Saturday rolled around, and we picked Courtney up at the airport, getting her settled into the spare bedroom. Naturally, there were some adjustments to be made in the way Whitney and I had been living, small ones, but soon everything fell into an orderly groove. Courtney was an exceptionally good-looking young woman, and it wasn't very long before she began to go out. Her evenings out gave Whitney and me ample time to ourselves, which ensured that our private life wasn't suffered. And along came that trip, which brought me home 2 days in advance and set everything rolling. I dawdled over breakfast to put off a return home. I had to shower and dress for work, but I did not have any particular sense of urgency. I wanted to give Courtney time to head out for her morning classes. If she was still there when I walked in, the natural question would be, "Where's Whitney?" And that would drag her into the mess I was trying to avoid. On the other hand, Courtney could have already caught in the middle of it all. She knew I wasn't supposed to come back yet, and she should have had a very good idea that Whitney wasn't home last night. Courtney had enough sense to do the numbers. 2 and 2 was a math formula that would quickly lead her to the answer. Still, maybe Whitney could convincingly tell her that's where she was at. An excuse can work just fine on the surface, but nothing Whitney could have told Courtney compared to what I knew was the real story, and that was all that mattered. As I sat there, sipping my coffee and revving over this depressing drama with myself, the bigger question intruded. Now what? Well, one thing was for damn sure, Whitney was history, but how was I going to deal with it? A confrontation was inevitable, but was it easier simply to pack up all her things and leave them outside, and then not even bother to talk to her? Then, there was the tougher problem of my brother. What was I supposed to do about Bill? That was a harder call because whatever I did was going to drag my parents in. Eventually, they would realize that something was up. They would point out to me how I was suddenly skipping family gatherings if Bill was going to be there, and I would have to break it to them, with ice, hard as it was going to be, about the situation. I couldn't lie to them, no matter how big of a mess it was going to become. I didn't stall long enough anyway. When I finally walked through the door, Courtney was still there. I had heard the phrase "her face turned pale" before, but I always thought it was just an expression, until I saw the color drain from Courtney's face the moment she laid eyes on me. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. She knew what Whitney was up to. What Courtney did not know was that I knew too, and the question, "How long has she been doing it?" made her take a complete tumble. She might have been expecting me to ask, "Where's Whitney?" and was probably furrowing her brain to come up with a decent lie to save her sister. But my straightforward question left no room for untruths. I could see the realization settle on her face. Her response was not quite what I had anticipated. "As far as I know, she never stopped," she replied quietly. I could do nothing but stare at her, perplexed. "She never stopped? What do you mean?" Courtney did not say anything promptly, and by the time she spoke, I knew she wished she didn't have to tell me more and couldn't have kept it pent up inside of her. Whitney's had steady boyfriends all through high school, and she cheated on every one of them. She straightened up when you took her home for the summer, but after you left, she went back to her former boyfriends, the different fellows she had met at school. I don't know all the details, but I do know each time since you have gone off on a trip, she has been dating another boy. She sometimes comes home at night, but usually she's not home by the time I leave for class. Her words hit me in the gut. I opened my mouth to say something to ask why she hadn't said anything sooner, but it quickly realized how stupid that sounded. Courtney and Whitney were sisters, family. That old saying about blood being thicker than water fit well, and I couldn't, at least not convincingly, fault Courtney for remaining loyal to her sister, not even though it was killing me. Courtney broke the silence. Now that you know, you were going to throw her out? You suppose, right? I said, my voice firmer than I felt. How long before I have to leave? That question threw me off. Your time frame? I asked, confused. How long do I have before I need to find a place to stay? I am assuming that you are kicking me out too. I shook my head. No, Courtney. You're not the one I'm sending outdoors. The person I'm kicking out is Whitney. Stay as long as you need to. I think things are going to get real uncomfortable between you two after she's gone, but you're not guilty of what she is. You didn't betray me. What you do about Whitney is up to you. However, she won't be around when you return from class. I'm going to bag all of her stuff up and put it outside. She can pick it up when she finally comes home. Still relatively relieved, but tensed, it seemed the only thing Courtney could do was nod, apparently at a loss for how to navigate the situation, now that the truth was finally out. As for me, there was no going back. Whitney's lies had unraveled, leaving me to pick up the pieces of what once seemed like such a promising future. Now, nothing was left to do but move forward. I went into the kitchen to grab some garbage bags, and by the time I returned, Courtney had already left for class. It didn't take long, about an hour, to erase all traces of Whitney from the apartment. I methodically bagged up every reminder of her presence, from the clothes in the closet to the scattered items she left behind. It felt strangely liberating, as if each packed bag lifted a weight off my shoulders. I knew her first class of the day didn't start until 10:15, and I hadn't called into work yet to let them know I was back 2 days early. So I figured she would probably come home before heading to class. I decided to wait. Sure enough, at 9:40, Whitney walked through the door. She seemed surprised to see me and immediately came over, bending down to kiss me. When did you get home? She asked, her tone casual, as if nothing in the world was amiss. Last night, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Why didn't you call me? She asked, frowning slightly. I did. You didn't answer. She let out a small, exaggerated sigh. I must have turned my phone off so we wouldn't be disturbed while we studied. I raised an eyebrow. We? Who's we? Just some girls from my managerial economics class, she said without missing a beat. We had a little study sleepover. Her lie came out so smoothly that if I hadn't seen everything with my own eyes, I might have believed her. But I knew better. Then, noticing the garbage bags outside the door, she asked, What's with all the bags out there? I looked her in the eye. It's all your stuff, Whitney. She blinked, momentarily confused. My stuff? What do you mean? I'm kicking you out of the apartment and out of my life. Whitney stared at me, her expression a mix of disbelief and shock. You're not serious. You can't be. We love each other. I laughed bitterly. I can't speak for you and your lying ass, but my love for you died last night when I watched you and my asshole brother walk into room 107 at the Willow Creek Motel. I got home just in time to see you climb into Bill's car and kiss the same guy you claimed you couldn't stand. Remember how you used to call him an arrogant asshole? Well, you sure didn't seem to mind last night. A long silence followed as she stood there, taking in my words. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she asked, The flat tires, that was you, wasn't it? I nodded. She sighed, seeming more annoyed than remorseful. I guess it's pointless to tell you that you're the only one I love, and that Bill was just sex. You'd be wasting your breath, I said, my voice cold. I don't care about your excuses. It doesn't matter why you did it. The fact is, you did it. And honestly, I'm just relieved I found out before we got married. The moment I said that, her whole demeanor shifted. The mask fell, revealing a side of her I hadn't seen before. Her expression twisted into a sneer, and she spat. We were never going to get married. You were just a convenience, a way to get through school with a steady source of sex. You're dependable, sure, but you don't make enough money, and you definitely don't have a big enough Johnson for me to tie myself to you permanently. She turned on her heel, marching toward the door. Before leaving, she shot me one last venomous look, flipping me the middle finger as she said, Go to hell! And just like that, she was gone. As the door clicked shut behind her, I muttered under my breath, Freaking liar, no good cheat. It was a knee-jerk reaction, the kind of thing a guy says when his ego is bruised. And if you really want to cut deep, tell a guy his Johnson isn't up to the job. That's the quickest way to wound his pride. But then, As I sat there replaying her words, I couldn't help but smirk. I thought back to all those times we'd been together, the way she'd reacted when we made love, the way her body responded to mine. She might have tried to hurt me with her words, but the truth was staring me right in the face. If my Johnson wasn't enough for her, then she deserved an Oscar for the performances she'd been putting on. Either she was lying now, or the world had been robbed of one of the greatest actresses of all time. I laughed quietly to myself, realizing something even more important. My body had always satisfied the one it was truly meant to, me, and in that moment, that was enough. The long, hot shower was just what I needed to eventually catch a couple of hours of sleep before dragging myself into work to submit the paperwork from my trip. It all felt oddly routine given how much my life had changed in the last 24 hours. When I got home that evening, I noticed all of Whitney's things were gone. The bags I'd packed up earlier had disappeared, no sign left that she'd ever existed. I threw together some leftovers in the fridge into a meal, not tasting any of it. Mind consumed by the next nasty task on the list. It was time to have a talk with my brother, Bill. I drove to my parents' house, going straight around the side to the garage apartment where Bill lived. My mind had rehearsed what to say, even while a small voice inside wasn't quite convinced words could do the job to air my anger. Reaching his door, I knocked. My heartbeat wasn't racing, but my anger churned just below the surface. A minute later, the door opened, and Bill stood there, flashing a smile when he saw me. He clearly had no idea what was in store. Whitney hadn't even called him to let him know they'd been caught. I didn't waste a single second, swinging my right hand into solid contact with his jaw. His smile was erased in a split second from his face as he lurched back in shock. I didn't give him time to recover. A sharp kick to his groin sent him crumpling to the floor. Lying there, gasping for air, I planted 2 more kicks in for good measure, the frustration of everything pouring out with each strike. I leaned over him, panting, and told him, "In case you haven't realized yet, I know about you and Whitney. This is just a little taste of what you'll get if you ever come near me again. And you can be the one to explain to Mom and Dad why I won't attend any family events if you're going to be there." With that, I turned and walked out, leaving Bill writhing on the floor, struggling for breath. As I finally reached my house, I found Courtney sitting at the kitchen table, her textbooks before her as she did homework. She looked up as I came in, her eyes wide with curiosity. "You did it," she said softly. "You really threw her out." "Did I not sound serious when I told you that was going to happen?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I don't know," she admitted. "You seemed so upset, but I thought maybe, because you loved her, you'd find a way to work things out." "Not in this lifetime, sweetie," I said, shaking my head. There was just no going back from what I had seen and what I knew now. "She called me," Courtney said, continuing. "Whitney. She wanted to know where I was going to stay once you kicked me out. She couldn't believe you were letting me stay." I shrugged, feeling the exhaustion of the day begin to wear me down. "It's been a long, hard day, Courtney. I'm going to take another shower and get some sleep." She nodded and took the cue that I didn't have much more energy for conversation tonight. I left her to her homework and went into the bathroom, ready to wash away what was left over from the day. It had been more than 24 hours, and so much had happened. Since the moment I had caught Whitney with Bill to the very fight that had just occurred, my world had flipped upside down. You'd think you're never going to be able to sleep after a day like today, but the second I lay in bed, it was just like my body just gave out, and I slept soundly like a log, without any dreams or thoughts of what the next day held. The next morning, I woke up to an unexpected and unwelcome surprise. As I walked into the kitchen, I found Bill sitting there, casually sipping coffee with Courtney. "What the heck are you doing here?" I snapped, my anger flaring up immediately. "We need to talk, bro," Bill said, his tone serious. "Why would I want to talk to a lowlife like you?" I shot back, unable to contain my disgust. Bill didn't flinch. "I need to explain what was going on." "Explain? You think it would matter? You stabbed me in the back, you freaking asshole." He looked at me, pleading. "You don't understand. I had to do it." "You had to do it?" I scoffed, shaking my head. "This, I've got to hear." Courtney stood up, sensing the tension. "I'll leave you two to it," she said softly. "I've got a class to get to." She gathered her things and slipped out the door, leaving us alone. Once she was gone, Bill took a deep breath. "Whitney was making me do it," he began. "For Christ's sake, Bill," I groaned. You expect me to believe that kind of bullshit? It's true, he insisted. She caught me doing something I needed to keep hidden, and she threatened to expose me to Mom and Dad if I didn't do what she wanted. I narrowed my eyes, skepticism clear in my voice. What could you possibly have been hiding that was worth betraying your own brother? He hesitated, then finally said it. She caught me necking with a guy. I'm bi, bro. I go both ways. And Whitney caught me in the act. I stared at him, stunned into silence. That wasn't what I had expected to hear. Bill continued. It all started during your trip to Baltimore. I was at this party, thrown by a couple I know. They're both bi, and they swing. It was a party for people like us, people who go both ways. I was there with a guy when Whitney showed up with some other guy I know, who's also bi. She pretended not to see me, and we avoided each other all night. But it was impossible to ignore what she was doing. Half an hour into the party, she was pulling a train. Every guy there, except me, had a turn, some more than once. I could barely process what he was saying, but Bill wasn't finished. The next day, she called me and said we needed to talk. We met at Whiskey Jack's, and she laid it out for me. Either I did what she wanted, when she wanted, or she'd tell Mom and Dad about what she'd seen. You know how Dad is about anyone who's not 100% straight. There's no way on earth I could let him find out. Mom might eventually accept it, but Dad? Never. So, I had no choice. I shook my head in disbelief. So you slept with her? Over and over again because she blackmailed you? Bill's eyes were filled with a mix of shame and anger. The woman is sick, bro. She didn't like me. Not really. She just loved having that kind of control over me. She got off on it. I can't even tell you how many sleepless nights I had, trying to figure out how to tell you what she was without exposing myself. And even now, I'm just waiting for her to tell Mom and Dad out of pure spite. But at least you're rid of her. I stood there for a long time, absorbing everything he'd said. It was twisted, but in a strange way, it made sense. Whitney had always been manipulative, and now I understood just how far that manipulation went. Thankfully, Whitney never did call our parents, and over time, Bill and I were able to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't easy, but I came to realize that he'd been trapped as much as I had. Courtney lived with me for another 7 months after that, and no, we never crossed any lines. Despite Whitney's repeated attempts to get her to move into the sorority house, Courtney wanted no part of the Greek scene. She eventually met a guy, and they moved in together, but we stayed good friends. Through it all, we remained close, and she was one of the few people who really understood how much I'd gone through. As for Whitney, I lost track of her after I kicked her out. A couple of times, Courtney tried to tell me about what Whitney was up to, but I shut her down pretty quickly. I didn't want to hear anything about my ex, no matter how tempting the gossip. Except for one time, one crucial time, when I was glad Courtney told me. The day of Whitney's wedding came, and I managed to slip in without anyone recognizing me. I sat in the back pew, silently watching the proceedings. The man she was marrying stood there, all proud and oblivious. I assumed he had the money and the qualities Whitney required. I nearly quivered with anticipation, waiting for my moment. Finally, the priest spoke the words I'd been waiting for. If there is anyone present who knows why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. I stood up, my heart racing with adrenaline. I have, I said loudly, all eyes turning to me. The bride is a cheating liar. While she was engaged to me, she cheated on me with my own brother. And when I was out of town, she was hooking up with multiple guys at swingers parties. The crowd was stunned into silence. I turned and addressed the groom directly. If that's the kind of woman you want, that's your choice. But remember the old saying, once a cheater, always a cheater. Without waiting for a response, I turned and strode out of the church, my head held high, a massive grin spreading across my face. It was, without a doubt, the sweetest revenge.